Hi, my name is Associate Professor Penny Edmonds, and I'm a historian here at the University of Tasmania. I've also worked in museums and in the heritage field as a curator. In fact, my very first training was as a sculpture and objects conservator, so I love museum objects and the stories they tell. Now, we often come to understand our colonial past through the written word or television, but objects too are often neglected and left as mere footnotes to history. Instead, by using objects as starting points for our research, we can walk through the back door of history and open up new vistas, and we won't necessarily end up at the front door of the same house. Now, looking closely at objects like this box from our frontier past can give us fresh perspectives on rethinking colonial history, especially in this case the history of Aboriginal and European relations in Australia. In the 1860s in Victoria, husband and wife Carolyn and Albert Leswaith created this decorated wooden box filled with tiny carved Aboriginal weapons. Carolyn was an accomplished painter in her own right, and she decorated the boxes with scenes of Aboriginal life, while Albert carved the 49 tiny weapons and he meticulously catalogued them on the inside lid of the box. The box was displayed at the Melbourne Intercolonial Exhibition of 1866, and it's now held in the collection at Museum Victoria, Melbourne. Now, I have to confess that years ago, when I first worked at Museum Victoria, I became completely obsessed with this complex object. It's a tiny composite of images, text, and miniature weapons, and very little was known about it. Some people speculated that the box might be a souvenir box, or even a toy box for children. But as I hope to show you today, I believe it's far more than that. Carolyn and Albert were the children of English settlers who arrived in the southeastern Australian frontier in the early 1840s. As children, they had close contact with the Tongarong people in the Goulburn River region of Victoria. This is to the far northeast of Melbourne and part of the Kulin Aboriginal Nation. And it's clear that in this earlier period of their lives on the frontier region, they had experiences with Aboriginal people that shaped the rest of their lives and also influenced the making of the box. So can an object take us on a journey through the colonial past? Why did they make this box? Is it just a toy box, or is it much more? The box can tell us many things about cross-cultural Aboriginal and European relations, colonial nostalgia, exhibitionary practice, about Aboriginal home and family life, but also about settlers seeking to make home on a violent frontier. Let's look at the box. It's a beautiful piece of handiwork. You can see highly detailed scenes of Aboriginal life by Carolyn covering the top and the sides. The scenes show the life of the Tongarong people, and they fall into traditional areas of 19th century ethnographic inquiry, such as hunting, ritual, warfare, categories through which it was thought that Aboriginal societies could be understood by Europeans. On the top of the lid is the inscription, quote, "Miniature weapons used by the Australian blacks by Carolyn Leswaith." Pasted onto the inside lid of the box are lengthy ethnographic notes in Albert's handwriting on how the weapons and tools were used. What's interesting is that the weapons or tools in the box seem to be performing the scenes drawn on the outside of the box. The scenes of everyday family life are drawn with Carolyn's light hand and attentive eye, as if we were looking into the window of Tongarong life. We see men hunting kangaroos, a so-called native fight, a corroboree, but also daily life scenes showing forming a camp on the Murray River and stripping the bark off trees to make bark shelters. If you look very closely, you can see people working together to make their homes, chopping bark together, dogs look on, and someone fishes in a watercraft. Women have children on their backs. There are no Europeans or signs of contact here, except perhaps the dogs. It's a peaceful, harmonious, and domestic scene. The tiny weapons are only 8 centimetres long, and they were probably taken from examples of weapons that Albert owned in his own large collection. So we can see that the box is animated by powerful discourses of 19th century ethnography and typology, and a fascination with Indigenous weaponry. But these are just some of the forces at play in this exhibitionary chest. Now, both Carolyn and Albert had lived on the frontier with their English families as young people in the 1840s. We know they'd experienced both close contact with Aboriginal people, but also the violence of the frontier. The scenes, as I've mentioned, show a pre-contact idyllic life. Yet, as we know, this period in the 1840s and 50s was a time when Aboriginal people were being aggressively moved off their land by squatters. Yet in every scene, the Tongarong people seem to be frozen in time, a feature common to colonial art in what is often referred to as the ethnographic present. In fact, it's doubtful that the time that Carolyn and Albert are seeking to depict ever truly existed in their lifetime. In this oil painting by Carolyn, titled Home Life on the Goulburn River, we see again a peaceful, everyday scene. Children and adults make homes by the river. Is it a work of memory or perhaps colonial nostalgia for Carolyn? We know that Albert Le Sueuf's father had been the notorious failed protector of the Aborigines in this area of Victoria. In the midst of the frontier, and as their land was taken by settlers, Aboriginal people around this area were so hungry that they would part with anything for a trifle to eat or drink, wrote one missionary. We need to understand that as European families were working hard to make their home in this new place, Aboriginal people were losing their homes, their food sources, and often their children. Albert's later book in his adult life, titled Personal Recollections of Early Victoria, was a reminiscence, and he said, "I have often as a boy been out alone with the Aborigines in their hunting expeditions, miles from any habitation, and they always took the greatest care of me. I liked them very much." Perhaps Albert's recollections were glorified by the passage of time, but there's a clear affection for Aboriginal people here. In these early experiences, we can see the origin of Albert's lifelong, if paternal, interest in Aboriginal people. Here's another of Carolyn's artwork, a watercolour titled Scenes of Aboriginal Families. Again, we see in her artwork a theme of Aboriginal home and family. Carolyn's family, the Cottons, lived closely to the Aboriginal people around Doogaluk Station, and her father, John Cotton's diaries, mentions his daughters giving their clothes to Aboriginal women and Aboriginal people weeding their garden in exchange for food. So the station was a shared place and possibly offered some protection from the violence of the frontier. But despite this, John Cotton, her father, believed that Europeans were fulfilling nature's law by replacing an inferior race with their own superior race. He felt it right that Aboriginal people would eventually pass away. Albert and Carolyn were married in 1853, and as settlers they would go on to build their own family. Carolyn would go on to have 10 children, and it's probably the reason for her modest output as an artist. This was a settler family who had a deep fascination with Aboriginal people. As adults, Albert and Carolyn went on to achieve a social status in Melbourne's scientific community as authorities on Aborigines based on these personal experiences. It gave them the power to publicly exhibit the Aboriginal subject in international forums such as the 1866 Intercolonial Exhibition, where they would exhibit this box. Later, Albert would become a powerful member of the Board for the Protection of Aborigines for 21 years, where he was to influence its policies. In this photograph from 1888, called Native Camp at Melbourne Zoo, you can see how this would manifest. Later in life, as director of the Melbourne Zoological Gardens, Albert put living Aboriginal people on display as living dioramas. He sought to popularise the Melbourne Zoo, and at the Centennial Exhibition of 1888, we can see here his concern with ethnography and the fashion for worldwide exhibition of Indigenous peoples in the name of racial science and taxonomies. These people have recently been identified. They are not nameless. Here we can see Tommy Avoca and his wife Rose placed in a traditional bark shelter with 2 children who did not belong to them. They were all moved from the Corranderk Aboriginal Station to be put on display in the zoo by Albert. Let's go back to the box. Unlike some settlers, the Luswaifs at least tried to humanise their Indigenous subjects. The box both archives and memorialises Aboriginal culture. And Carolyn's artwork in the box and elsewhere, with its focus on home life and family, the very things that were being destroyed by colonialism at the time, I feel is particularly moving. So the box slides elusively between memoir, toy box, educational device, and ethnographic object lesson. It's a past world compressed, and it is a museum in a box. Finally, were the Luswaifs operatives of empire or interested, sympathetic settlers? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. I'll leave this with you, but what we do see is that the box remains a colonial souvenir, an unsettling memento of unresolved experience of times past, where scholarly engagement with 19th century ethnographic and scientific narratives sits hand in hand with the familiar, and indeed familiar, and difficult truths of colonial conquest. Thanks.